what the B.G.Kumar Lecture is all about, and then introduce our distinguished speaker for the day, Professor Kunal Sen. The B.G.Kumar Lecture is actually in memory of one of our colleagues, Bhaskar Gopal Krishna Kumar, or Gobu as we used to call him. He was a member of the faculty at CTS during the period 1990 to 1993. He did his education at Cambridge and Oxford, having finished his DPhil in economics under Professor Amartya Sen. And then he joined the center as an associate professor, and he was here only for about 3 years, and thereafter he passed away. Professor Kumar used to work a lot on Kerala model of development, population and development, and also agriculture price setting. These were the areas of his interest. Now, he was an extremely affectionate person, and he was very well liked here in the campus. And if he had been alive, he would have been a very important, occupied a very important position in the CDS hierarchy. Okay. We are very sad that he is no more with us, but I think his family has endowed a very generous endowment on the basis of which we have been having a prestigious set of lectures called the B.G. Kumar Lecture Series. The first lecture was given in 1995 by Professor Amartya Sen, followed by a number of other important speakers. And if I may just quickly say, the people who have spoken or given lectures under this series are Professor Pranab Bharathan, Professor Maitresh Ghatak, Professor Francis Stewart, Professor Robin Jeffrey, Professor Yong Il Yu, and Professor Sonalji Desai. And this year, we are very fortunate in having a very distinguished economist. And he's Professor Kunal Sen, who is currently the director of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economic Research, or UNU-WIDER as it is called, in Helsinki in Finland. Professor Kunal Sen has taken his PhD from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and thereafter he was working at the University of Manchester, where he still holds a professorial position as of Professor of Development Economics at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. He has been a consultant to a very large number of national and international agencies, like the UK Department for International Development, the Asian Development Bank, and the International Development Research Center in Canada, or the IDRC. He has worked extensively on South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. He has a very enviable record in terms of publication, large number of peer-reviewed articles and books, and I think he's also going to talk about a new book that he has actually just recently published. His area of research is in the interface of international development and political economy, and he has also won 2 prestigious awards, the Sanjay Lal Memorial Prize and the Dudley Sears Memorial Prize for excellence of his research. Now, Professor Kunal Sen is no stranger to CDS. He has actually visited CDS in person several years ago, maybe in the late 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. And he was actually planning to come here much later, in this academic year. Okay. So, Professor Sen, a very warm welcome to you. And now the floor is up to you to do the lecture on Is India a Land of Opportunity?
Thank you, Professor Mani. I'm delighted to give the 13th B.G. Kumar lecture. I have read Gopu's, and as we all know, Gopu, his work, and in fact, the topic I've chosen today really reflects the deep understanding that Gopu had on social issues, social justice issues, not only in Kerala but also in India. And so that's one reason the topic that I've chosen is very much reflects his own passion for social justice in India. Now, let me first share my screen, and then we can proceed with the lecture. As Professor Mani mentioned, I'm a friend and well-wisher of CDS. I have visited CDS a few times. I'm sorry I could not be there in person for this lecture, but I'm looking forward to visiting CDS next year. So my lecture, let me put on the full screen mode. So my lecture is titled a little more provocatively, is India Land of Opportunity? And I'm trying to explain to you what I'm trying to say in this particular title in terms of the topic itself. So the kind of the background would be a question that all of us think about in relation to our own children, perhaps too. And the question is that the chances of a child, what are the chances of a child growing up in Karnataka reaching high income or occupational levels than the parents any higher than those of a child in Bihar? We often think about our children, if we think about them, how much are they going to progress in socially, economically. And of course, this is a question that is particularly relevant for those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so if there are differences in social mobility across India, what explains this? And what can policymakers do about the lack of social mobility that we will see actually in my lecture, which is very evident among certain social groups? Now, this is something that is fundamental. It's about the inequality of opportunity, but we know little about it in the context of India. And that's what my lecture is about. Now, if you think about the literature in India, a lot of it has been about poverty, and that's rightly so, because India still has very high rates of people below the official poverty line. And of course, we know prior to the pandemic, there was progress on reducing poverty, not only in India, but across the world. 42% of the world's population were extreme poverty in 1981. That went down to below 10% in 2015. We're going to definitely see an increase in that number post the pandemic. There's no doubt about that. And so, of course, there's been always been strong interest on the question of reducing poverty, both in India, but also globally. Now, linked to this question of poverty, of course, the question of social mobility. How do we make people not only move above the poverty line, but far ahead of in terms of social progress in where they should be, especially not only themselves, but their children and their grandchildren. So can more pronounced progress in upward mobility be achieved? And what can we learn from the extensive literature on social mobility in industrial countries? We have seen a lot of work on this recently in the US and elsewhere in the developed world. And what needs to be done differently with regards to research and policy when the focus is shifted to low-income settings? Now, to answer this kind of questions, UNE Wider, in fact, the very first year that I took over as director, started a major project on social mobility in developing countries. And the reason we did this is because we really believe that this is a fundamental issue of where we should move our research focus beyond poverty to a broader set of outcomes that we should think about. Now, let me first define social mobility so that we understand exactly what we're talking about. Social mobility is defined as the ability to move from a lower to high level of education, occupational status, or from a lower to high social class or income group. And it is seen as a great hope of economic development. For many, it should also be one of the fundamental characteristics of a good society. What we understand by a good society, the people should be able to climb as high as they're able to, and not to be hindered because of gender, race, class, or economic disadvantage. This is essentially what we mean by the question of equality of opportunities. Social mobility is important, and in fact, interesting enough, social mobility is very clearly linked to inequality of outcomes. So inequality of opportunity with the social mobility is very clearly linked to the inequality of outcomes. There's a very famous a curve called the Great Gatsby curve, which shows the relationship between inequality and social mobility. And what we're trying to see is that countries which do very well in reducing inequality or have low inequality also have higher social mobility or intergenerational mobility. As you can see from here, in fact, the country I'm in right now, Finland, has relatively low inequality of outcomes, but it also has very high social mobility, because on the vertical axis, what you're measuring is the persistence of economics and social status. So the lower we are on the vertical axis, the more there is mobility. And you can see Denmark and Finland are known to be actually countries where we have both inequality being low, but also high social mobility. And then we go up the curve and you can see countries such as Chile, Brazil, Panama, so on, where we have high inequality and low social mobility. And then in the middle, especially in the developed world, the US is very well known for not only having high inequality, but also low social mobility. So the point here is that there is a reason that we should also be interested in social mobility because it is also linked to inequality as we see it today. And that's important to keep in mind. So what I'm going to speak about, as Professor Mani mentioned, I'm going to speak a little bit about a book that we have just published based on the project that we did in VNU Wider. The book is called Social Mobility in Developing Countries. And we're going to use the book to talk about the research gaps we see, the implications for research practice and policy options. I brought this part into my lecture because I felt a lot of students out there who might want to understand what do they need to do in terms of future research on social mobility, particularly in the context of India. And then I'm going to speak a little bit about what do we know about social mobility in India in the long theory, so over a long period of time. And then finally, work that I'm doing right now, it's work in progress, is how do traditional institutions such as caste affect social mobility in Indian villages? And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So, social mobility in developing countries, concepts, methods, and determinants. This is the title of the book. The book came out earlier this year. It's edited by Vegard Iversen, Anirudh Krishna, and myself. And what we tried to do in this book, we were very keen that in this book, we would bring in all the different disciplines who work on social mobility. This will not be a book by economists. So what we did in this book is brought together historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and economists to speak about mobility in the context of their own discipline. That was very important because we really believe that this conversation between disciplines was very important in understanding this particular topic. And so this is a book that brings together different scholars. And of course, we had the scholars who speak about their, as they see, social mobility from their discipline. And we tried to bring in the more important scholars working on these issues. And of course, the focus was on developing countries. The book is open access on the VNU Wider website, and anybody can download it for free. And especially for the students here, certainly encourage you to take a look at the book. So what the book contains is an opening review, which was put together by the 3 editors, plus substantial chapters by top scholars, sociology, history, political science, economics, anthropology from across the globe. We try to make sure we had scholars covering Latin America, Africa, and in Asia in this book. And I'm going to speak a little bit about what we learned from the book, and I'm going to spend a bit of time now talking about the knowledge gap as we see it, issues, implications for research practice, and possibly some policy options for social mobility. This is not just for India, but it certainly applies for India as well. So, as I said, we tried to bring together different social science disciplines, and there were 3 sets of motivation that guided this joint effort. One, what are the knowledge gaps understanding social mobility in developing countries? And to what extent can we try and address these knowledge gaps? Second, what are the innovations and improvements we can do in research practice? And especially relevant, again, in a developing country context. And what are the kind of policy advice we can try to provide in enhancing social mobility in developing country settings? So this essentially, there were 3 things we tried to do. Try to address knowledge gaps, or identify knowledge gaps rather, and then what kind of improvements we can do, and innovation we can do in research practice, and finally, what kind of policy advice can come out from the work we have seen in the developing country context. So I'm going to speak on each of the 3 bullet points now. So knowledge gaps. Now, we find there were 3 key knowledge gaps. The first knowledge gap, and this is partly why I myself been working on India quite a bit now on social mobility, is that we don't really have good data as yet and comparative measure social mobility. So the question would, for example, that does India have higher social mobility than China? The answer is that we don't really know, or for the matter, any other developing country context. In contrast, if I asked somebody, what would you know about social mobility in Finland versus the US, they would be very clear answers, and we have very good data that addresses those kind of questions. So that's a huge problem here. We don't seem to have the data and comparable measure social mobility in the developing country context. The second big knowledge gap is that we don't really know much about mother-daughter mobility. There has been some work on father-son mobility in developing countries. And this is a problem that is pointed out in the book itself by Nancy Look, a sociologist, and also by Florence Satoshi, a sociologist, and by Divya Vait, an anthropologist. That we know very little about mother-daughter mobility as compared to father-son mobility in low-income countries. Now, this is a deeply unsatisfying set of affairs because it is one-sided and incomplete. You can't talk about mobility only with father-son and not talk about mother-daughter. But also because we are seeing increasing number of women progressing to secondary schooling and not to university, and female labor force participation has increased sharply in many developed countries. Not, of course, we know, not in India, but elsewhere, we have seen that. So this is something that needs to be done, something we need to do more in understanding and addressing mother-daughter mobility. The third knowledge gap, and this is pretty important, is that we have very little knowledge, limited understanding of the drivers of mobility. So, we have a multiplicity of environmental factors that can explain why advancing intergenerational mobility is more challenging in developing than in industrial countries. Now, in the literature that we have in the US, for example, of course, the most important work has been done by Raj Chetty and co-authors in the US on mobility in the US and also elsewhere too. The kind of factors that might explain mobility, say in the US, one can argue that the factors that are relevant in the Indian context is far more complex, far more difficult to pin down. For a poor child born in a slum in Mumbai, Nairobi, or Rio de Janeiro, there can be multiple and simultaneously operating determinants of weak intergenerational mobility, including poor schooling, lack of well-paid jobs, a scarcity of role models in the neighborhood, and various forms of group-based discrimination. It's not just one factor that might explain it, as is often the case in the context of the US or other rich developed countries. And one of the problems, I think, this is why it's important to have this conversation with other disciplines, because economists, of course, approach determinants of mobility in what we call using causal inference. So experimental methods or causal experimental methods, which are fine to isolate one factor related to other factors. But then in the context of a developing country, where there are many factors operating at the same time, as I've argued, in understanding, say, what happens to a poor child in a slum in Mumbai, we need to go beyond experimental or causal experimental methods that are used in economics. And so less useful in situations where we have complex and interactive causes inhibiting social mobility. This is why economists, for example, need to work with sociologists and anthropologists and political scientists to understand what the determinants of mobility. And this is something we make a big argument for in this book. On research practice, again, 3 lessons. First is that when we talk about social mobility, and you have 2 scholars talking mobility, often they're using different concepts. That leads to a lack of comparability and often quite confusing for those who are trying to understand mobility in a particular context. So we need to, and as Gary Fields argues in this book, that we need to have greater precision in social scholarly work. Define your concept, make clear what exactly you're trying to measure. And that will be easier then for others to then see how much they can replicate that work in a different kind of context. And that's something we make a big argument for, more precision. And so, for example, we often find that when we try to understand whether one country has more mobility than the other country, whether mobility is increasing or falling, whether mobility is higher in rural than urban areas, more often we see shorter in ambiguity due to lack of conceptual precision. So that's a problem that we have in the literature, and this probably applies more to developing countries, but also applies to some extent to developed countries, the lack of precision. Secondly, other thing that we identified in the book is measures and methods that have been developed and used to study intergenerational mobility in industrial countries have often been applied in low-income country settings without scrutiny, with understanding whether the measures actually stand up in a different setting. And there are many problems with that. And that's something we argue that we need to spend more time trying to develop measures that are more relevant for low-income settings. And we propose certain ideas in the book on how we can do that. And that I don't have the time for, but in the book, we spend some time discussing this. And so this is something that's important, that we need to try to find measures and methods which we can borrow from the literature that we have for the West, but try to adapt it for low-income settings. And that's something that's also very important. The third research practice, the third practice dividend that we identify are the gains from interdisciplinary conversations. Perhaps more than any other topic, this is an area where we do need to have interdisciplinary conversations. While often, we may make a deal about interdisciplinary research, and we often are, and there's a risk of becoming a trope on this, which we provide examples in the volume of how the chapters really help understand mobility from different perspectives. And it allows us also to bring in new ideas and lines of inquiry. So this is something we argue is very important to take the work of social mobility in developing countries forward in the next few years. Now, policy options. So policy options, we are clear, very, very carefully saying these are policy options that we are getting for the current state of the literature. But there's a lot more to be done before we can absolutely be clear that these policy options will work in different contexts. But in many ways, some of the policy options are not perhaps very controversial. And the first three set of policies that we argue are very important for raising mobility are around absolute mobility. So somebody moving up from, say, primary schooling to secondary schooling, or from being an agricultural laborer to being a government clerk, are examples of absolute mobility. And we've argued that the first set of policies which are needed are about bringing broad-based human capital investment, education, healthcare, sanitation, so on. Jerry Behrman in the book has a very nice chapter on this. Now he's developed that into a book, which he just published through Cambridge University Press. Elements, it's on our website, just came out a few weeks back, where he makes the argument why human capital investment is very important in understanding in bringing about social mobility. Also, of course, and it's very obvious in the Indian case that we need to have an increase in good jobs and business opportunities. You can't move up the occupation ladder if there are not good jobs waiting for you at the higher end of the ladders. So that's very important. And the third thing is that we need to also make sure that while we talk about upward mobility, in India, and I'll present some evidence later in the lecture, we see a lot of downward mobility. So you might have a parent being a teacher, but the child might not be a teacher, might be an agricultural laborer. And that's quite frightening. Why should that happen? So we see the situation of precarious livelihoods in developing countries. So we certainly need to at least make sure that we do not have downward mobility before we actually bring about sustained upward mobility. And that's important to keep in mind, particularly in the context of India. On the other policy option, three more again, these are really going outside what normally economists would talk about to a large extent. So the fourth policy option is about social networks. And in this particular area, one of the three editors of the book, Anirudh Krishna, has done some amazing work in the case of India, as you know. Now, here, of course, social networks make a big difference, both in tangible ways, access to opportunities, information about jobs, referrals, but in intangible ways, by influencing aspirations and cultural capital, and by providing role models to poor children in the neighborhood. So this is something that is being increasingly understood as something being very important. Apart from systemic changes happening in the labor market, we also need to see how networks can make a difference, especially in intangible ways. As I said, in bringing about aspirational change among poor children and so on. And that's something that in this particular chapter written by Anandi Mani and Emma Riley, they make a very strong argument to understand the nature of social networks and how that can influence policy options. The fifth policy option is that discrimination needs to be countered directly. There's a chapter in the book on group-based discrimination, which in the Indian case would be caste-based on discrimination or religious discrimination. And here again, policies need to aim at longer-term attitudinal changes, which are very important here. So this is a longer-term, much more complex, takes more time, but very important at the same time. And finally, and so of course, this is not only about caste and religion, it's also about gender. Nancy Luke says in the book that policies that promote egalitarian views and less restrictive gender norms among mothers can help bring about greater labor force participation by daughters and daughters-in-law. So this is also about changing social norms. Finally, it needs to be remembered, there's a very nice chapter by Ravi Kanpur in the book that ultimately the policies to promote social mobility have to be seen as a part of a broader suite of policies for social justice and social cohesion. So the concern for social mobility should not result in a reduction of focus on income redistribution. And that's important. And this goes back to what I said about the Great Gatsby curve. Partly because redistribution may be necessary for achieving social mobility objectives like equality educational outcomes. So it's not an either-or question. To promote social mobility does not necessarily mean that you have to forego the focus on redistribution in the current juncture. And that's something that we make a very strong argument for in the book, especially in the chapter by Ravi Kanpur. Okay, I'm going to now move on to what I really want to speak on, the social mobility in India. I'm going to spend a bit of time on a paper that I recently just came out, and I'm going to go down to work that is still going on, work in progress, where I'll speak a little bit more what we have been finding when you look at rural India in particular. So the first part of this part of the lecture will be on a paper that's just published, Multigenerational Mobility Among Males in India. Aditya Kuntu, my PhD student, and myself came out in Review Income and Wealth. Now, when we started this project, which is part of Anusud's PhD, we felt that in India we have had now some papers that look at generation mobility from parent to child, but we don't really know what happens across generations. And that was something that's really important because multi-generational mobility tells us what's happening in the long duration, over a long period of time. So what we did here is that we used the Indian Human Development Survey in a fairly innovative way because there's been no work that actually tries to capture mobility across 3 generations, but we found a way to do that. And we looked at occupational education mobility, and I'll explain how we did it in this particular case. Now, obviously, looking at mobility across grandparent, parent, child does allow us to look at equal opportunity over a long period of time. We're looking at pretty much post-independence India in this case. And of course, it is important to do that because in societies where there's dynastic transmission of wealth and social standing, intergenerational persistence of economic social status is likely to occur, inhibiting social progress. So if we do see a lot of dynastic transmission of social standing, economic wealth, income, and so on, then we will not see a lot of mobility across generations. So that's really important to understand. And of course, the question is, what do we know about India? Now, one of the problems, and this is exactly why we started looking at this particular this question using the Indian Human Development Survey, is that there isn't any data that looks at mobility. Forget about data that even looks at mobility for 2 generations. There's almost nothing on 3 generations. And this is not just for India, but also applies to other countries. So what we took advantage of is this particular data set asked the heads of households about their father's main occupation education level. And we also took advantage of the fact that many houses in India are multi-generational. In other words, many sons stay with the parents. Sons and sons, mostly not daughters, of course, because they marry and move elsewhere, some other family, other part of the country, perhaps. So here we focus on education, occupation, mobility, because again, income mobility is not a very good measure in India. Well, firstly, because the data doesn't ask much about income for the for the head of the household's parents, but also because in the low-income country context, income measurement is a problem. And again, this is something we discuss in the book, that perhaps in a low-income country context, income mobility should not be the main focus of inquiry when it comes to social mobility. And that's something we need to keep in mind, that is why the literature on India cannot mimic the literature on the US, where we have very good data on income, which is what Raj Chetty and others have been using. And that's an argument that needs to be kept in mind for anybody doing research on mobility in India, that to the extent possible, perhaps one should look at education, occupation, this is mobility rather than income. And I think that's something that we should be careful about. So how do we do this for the case of education occupation? Well, occupation, of course, we have the standard classification sociologists have used. We just use that. So they have categories on professionals, clerical, other occupations, farmers, high status vocational occupations, and lower status occupationals, and agricultural manual laborers. Now, what we did in this particular classification, we twisted in one important way. And this is something that I did in a paper separately with B.G.Kumar Davis and Anirudh Krishna, which came out in EPW some years back. We argued that the sociology literature in the West puts all vocational occupations in the same level. But in India, that's not the case. In India, if you are in a caste-based vocational occupation that has lower social standing than an occupation that is not caste-based. So for example, if you're a tailor, that is often caste-based versus if you're a technician, which is not caste-based. So therefore, in India, we need to differentiate between higher status vocational occupation and lower status vocational occupation, and lower status being often caste-based and traditional. And so we spent a bit of time in this work, which came out from the earlier work I did with B.G.Kumar Lecture and Anirudh Krishna in the EPW paper I mentioned, where we tried to go through each occupation and say, is this a caste-based occupation or not among vocational occupations? And by doing so, we could create 2 categories in vocational occupations. One was lower status, another higher status. And of course, I've given the occupation codes here, and you can easily check this if you look at the IHGS data. It's pretty straightforward. So that's the occupational categorization. You might say that farmers are put in higher level than vocational occupations, and that's an issue that we thought about. Now, of course, among farmers, we have small farmers, we have medium-sized with small holdings, and we have large farmers. In this grouping, we did not differentiate across different size of farms. We put them in category 4 in a higher status, but we also in several robustness tests, we also brought them below the category 3 and 2 to see what difference it makes. It doesn't make a huge difference, actually. The big movement is always from the lower categories to the upper categories, that's categories 5 and 6. And education is very straightforward. Illiterate with less than primary, literate with less than primary, primary, middle, secondary, higher secondary, post-secondary. 7 educational categories is standard in the literature on educational mobility, and so we stayed with that. Okay, so this is the really important, and perhaps for those who are the PhD or research students out here. How did we manage to, from the IHG's data, which has not been used to look at multi-generational mobility, how did we get the generational, 3 generations education occupation? Okay, here's what we did. So we have the head of the household, Gen 2, or G2. We know, and we know from the questionnaire that their father's education occupation is. That's Gen 1, the grandparent. Now we're not interested in the grandparents' siblings, because that information we don't have, so they're not included in the classification. But we also know that the head of household's son either resident in the same household or non-resident in the same household, not resident in the same household. In the second 2004 round of IHGS, they also had a module on non-resident members of the household. That was very useful. So we could therefore not only look at those sons who are in the household, but also those who are not. And that is really important, because some of the work in India does not do that. And there is a major problem of co-residency bias, as it's often called. You have to worry about those who've left the household. If you don't, there's a major selection problem. And so in this particular case, we could identify pretty much almost all those sons who have left the household and are in some other part of the country. And that's really important. And we have that information. So we could therefore construct 3-generational education occupational status. So that's the way we did it. Now, let's look at by generation to generation pairs, occupational mobility across generations, and G1 and G2. G1 is the grandparent, G2 is the parent, G3 is a son. Now, you can see that the thing that strikes you right away, is that in the lowest category occupation, agricultural laborers, there's really not much mobility up, because you can't obviously go down this lowest category. There's not much mobility up. And that's really, really surprising. We're talking about 3 generations. We're talking about almost 40, 50 years of data. But we don't seem to see much mobility for those who are agricultural laborers, where the grandparent was an agricultural laborer, the parent was an agricultural laborer, and the son is also an agricultural laborer. At the same time, so we see a lot of stickiness there. At the same time, you'll see a lot of stickiness in the highest level occupation category, professionals. So if your grandparent was a professional, you're very likely to be, the father is also likely to be a professional, and so is the son. So in those 2 categories, the extreme ends of the occupational ladder, we see stickiness. But we see a lot more movement, a lot more fluidity in the middle categories. We see movements both up or down the middle categories. And that's interesting. So that's occupation. Education, of course, as you expect in India, increasingly children are going to school. And we can see that. We can see that those who are illiterate, that particular the green bar in this diagrams, you can see that has been shrinking over time. In fact, by the time we come to G3, the sons, there's very few children who are illiterate. So that's been a big feature of the data, that we see a lot of mobility upwards in education, and that's not surprising. Having said that, you still don't see enough mobility in a way that you expect the grandfather to be illiterate, or let's say even primary school educated, and the son, the grandson rather, is say at least secondary educated or university educated. We don't see much evidence of that. The mobility movement up is a little bit like 1 step up, or maybe maximum 2 steps up. And that's interesting too. So in that sense, over these 3 generations, we haven't seen very sharp upward mobility. Now, we use this Sankey plot, which are actually very nice to put in one place. And this is on occupation. And you can see, really speaking what I said earlier, that those who are agricultural laborers here, right at the bottom of this graph, pretty much stay here at the same time. This is the grandparent, this is the father, this is the parent, this is the grandson or the son. We don't see much evidence there. Some movement here in the parent to son generation, but not much. And then you can see this group here, farmers, a lot of mobility downwards. A lot of farmers became agricultural laborers over the 3 generations. So we see very little mobility up among the lowest occupational category, agricultural laborers, and we see a lot of mobility down for the farmer category, and not much else going on there. And you can see there's not much else going on there over the 3 generations. So that's really important, and that's quite revealing actually. On education, illiterates, as I said, have shrunk sharply over time. This is the illiterate category, and you can see by the time we get from here to here to here, it's really shrunk. But again, what you tend to see is that not much evidence of sharp upward mobility. You can see here some people that the parents, the grandparents are illiterate, and the parents are primary or secondary educated, but not so much movement up there. And even here, with not much movement up to the higher level education. And that's really interesting. The other thing that's interesting is that we are seeing quite a bit of downward mobility. We do seem to see people where the grandparent is maybe secondary educated and the parent is primary educated and the son is also primary educated. That's quite surprising that we see downward mobility in the data when you wouldn't have expected that for educational mobility. Because normally you expect that your child is at least as educated as the parent and the grandparent. So that's also interesting. Now I'm going to just very quickly talk about the caste story. And the caste story is quite interesting because on occupation first, because on caste, we see that OBCs see a lot of mobility, like the forward caste, the general caste, we call them in the paper. But among SCs and STs, we don't see very much mobility. As we know, SCs and especially SCs are very much, a large proportion of them are agricultural laborers. And you can see over time in this one here, really not much mobility upwards. And so this persistence or rather the lack of mobility that we already saw in the data for everyone is particularly evident for those who are scheduled caste, scheduled tribes. And that's something that is obviously of great concern. Why have we not seen more mobility among this group here, where a large proportion of the grandparents were agricultural laborers? Why have we not seen over time that increasingly their children and their grandchildren moving up the occupational ladder? Because we don't see that evidence of that. And as you can see, the other thing that we found interesting is among SC/ST, we do see downward mobility quite a bit. That's not that evident for the forward caste here. If your grandparents are professional, highly unlikely that the grandson will be not a professional, or at least not be a clerical worker. Here, we see a lot of downward mobility. So even when the grandparent is a professional, we seem to see the grandson moving downwards to absolutely like primary education, for example. And that's really very, very worrying. Why is that? So education mobility, the story is actually a bit more positive, I would say. More mobility here, evident across all the social groups, including SC/STs. So here the general story is much more upward mobility. So that's very different occupational mobility. So what we did in this paper, and I'm not going to present the economic analysis for lack of time, I'm just going to summarize the main findings. So we find that mobility is increased across the ratio of education, but not for occupation. And of course, one has to keep in mind that there's no point if you are getting more educated and you're not getting a higher level occupation, you might even argue, what's the return to your education? So while one might say that in India there has been more educational mobility, it's also quite worrying that there's not been corresponding occupational mobility. So we have increasingly people who are getting educated, children getting educated, but not able to move up the occupational ladder. And we also find stark difference across social groups, with individuals belonging to socially disadvantaged communities lagging behind in social progress. Multigenerational mobility for Muslims in education and occupation have decreased relative to the forward caste in comparison to Hindus over the 3 generations. And while we find an increase in education mobility for other disadvantaged groups, such as scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward classes compared to general castes, we do not find evidence of increased occupational mobility over the 3 generations. If anything, we seem to find that the last generation, the grandson generation, have fallen behind on occupational mobility compared to the general or forward caste. And that's quite striking. So just to sort of say, if I had to sort of answer the question, is India a land of opportunity? Obviously, it is not if you are from a socially disadvantaged background. So now I want to speak a little bit, I've got about 15 minutes or so, about work that we are doing currently. This is really work in progress, but I thought I'd just present this a little bit here to give a flavor of where we should go. It's again for students in this group to think about how we should push the agenda of social mobility in India, given the data sets we have. This is about caste dominance and social mobility in rural India. Now, what the question we try to answer in this particular work that we're doing right now is that are there any systematic differences in possibly social mobility across villages in India, where we do see a big challenge, as we already saw, so many agricultural laborers have over generations who have not moved up the occupation ladder. If there is systematic differences, how does village social structure affect mobility? Does it matter whether the village is dominated by your own social group as compared to a situation where another social group dominates it? And the idea from this paper comes from an earlier paper that one of my co-authors in this paper, B.G.Kumar did, which came out in Economic Development and Cultural Change, which talks about caste dominance and understanding caste dominance. Though in that paper, they do not look at social mobility. This is what we do in this paper. So this paper is at this point called Barrier or Catalyst, Traditional Institutions and Social Mobility in Rural India. Vega Davison, who was one of the editors of the book that I mentioned earlier, Anusa Kundu, my former PhD student, a colleague of mine in Wider, Rahul Lahoti, and myself. So this is a paper that's still in progress. So the motivation really comes from the work. Again, we felt the work that we have been seeing in the context of the US and their countries does provide some kind of ways to think about what we should think about in the case of India. So, for example, the most important model of mobility that has been put forward is a paper done in a paper by Gary Becker and Tomes, which talks about how really it's about parental education, parental endowments, so parental income and so on. In that kind of work, we haven't seen the role of neighborhoods and communities. But in this more recent work that Raj Chetty has been doing with co-authors, they find that high mobility areas tend to have less residential segregation, less income inequality, better primary schools, greater social capital, and more stable families. And if that's the case in the US, where these things matter, it certainly should be the case in India. So it's reasonable to expect that neighborhood and spatial variation to be particularly pronounced across rural areas of developing countries, such as India. And that was the motivation of why we started looking at this question in the context of India. So hurdles like illiterate parents, low quality schools, credit constraints, lack of supportive influences in one's neighborhood, non-availability of sources of information and guidance about how alternate career paths operate and are shaped are multiple and formidable in the case of rural India. And you can imagine how they all interact and make it so difficult for poor children to hope to move up in education, and particularly in occupation. That was really the motivation trying to look at this. So here we can look at one specific key explanatory variable, village caste composition, and how that affects mobility prospects. So we're going to use the intuition that we got from this paper that was published in Economic Development and Culture Change a few years back, where the argument is that it's a difference between whether you dominate the village, your own social group, or whether you're living in a village dominated by the upper caste. It is a land dominance. And this argument goes back to, in part, to Emerson University's theory of caste dominance, which is where the term caste dominance comes from in our work. So, and there may be very many reasons why living in a village where your social group dominates may be good for you. But there may be reasons why it may not be good for you. And I'll explain what that might be. There may be many reasons why living in a village dominated by upper caste might be good for that socially the disadvantaged communities in that village. But it also may be reasons why they may not be good for them for mobility prospects. So it's not obvious, it's an empirical question whether you are better off being in a village dominated by your own social group, or you're better off being in a village dominated by the upper caste. And this is why we call this the enclave effect. When you're dominated by the village is dominated by their own social group, the proximity advantage or operation disadvantage if you're living in a village dominated by upper caste. So that's the intuition behind what you can try. Now, why? So let's just think about the possible mechanisms that might explain why enclave effects may be positive or negative for social mobility, or proximity effect could be positive or negative for social mobility. This is just a set of possible mechanisms. There could be a lot more, but these are ones we study right now in the paper. So enclave effect. If you stay in the village where your own social group dominates, say you're a Dalit, it's a Dalit dominated village, obviously you might encounter less discrimination, there'll be more social cohesion. But also it'd be possible that village public goods are inferior, infrastructure may be inferior. And it could also be possible that the village that you're staying in is quite far away from metros. And therefore there's a location disadvantage to being where you are. So access to jobs and services are weaker in that village. If you're living in a village dominated by upper caste, the positives are you're locationally better situated, you're closer to metros, urban areas, you have better village public goods, you have higher access to education institutions. The negatives, of course, is that if you're living in an upper caste dominated village, there's more discrimination, residential schooling, jobs, and so on. As I said, this doesn't exhaust the set of mechanisms. There are much more that one can study. But we're just pinpointing this because this is where we have data to look at more closely. But we're going to try to extend the set of mechanisms as we take the work forward. Now, let's think about land dominance and caste groups using IHGS data. So if you're an OBC, for example, you can see that if you are dominating the village in terms of population, you're also dominating the village in terms of land. So most OBCs, where they dominate the village in terms of population, they also dominate the village in terms of land. So total land that is owned by OBCs in that village. You can see this amount here, and there are a lot of villages in this category. As you can see, around 45% of the villages that OBCs, where they dominate by population, dominate by land. So they're land dominant. For SCs, it's quite different. Even if you dominate by population, usually in that case, you also have a situation where the dominance is of the upper caste of land. So you may dominate by population, but you don't dominate by land. And that means that you don't often have the political power or the social power because land is owned by the upper caste or by other social groups. You can see that clearly. You can see the big dominance here, land dominance of upper caste in ST population-dominated villages. ST is just opposite. If you dominate by population, you dominate by land. And that's not surprising. We know ST villages are often where STs are homes, probably the only group perhaps living in that village. And you can see here, ST-dominated villages by population are also dominated by land in the same social group. Muslims, again, we can see that a lot of the dominance, when they live even by population dominance, where they are dominant in the population of the village, the dominance on land is with upper caste. You can see this here. And sorry, Muslims actually do also see. I'm sorry about that. No, it's also we see very similar patterns as we saw for STs, very similar. And then finally, upper caste villages, if you dominate by population, almost invariably you dominate by land. Hardly any village that you can see here in this category where the dominance is not of land for upper caste, is dominated by population. So that's really interesting how this variation, we can see this variation across land and population dominance across the social groups in India. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly talk, and I'm not going to spend time in the empirics. It's a very straightforward, intuitive approach. We have a mobility measure on the left-hand side, upward mobility. So 0 if there's no upward mobility, and it's 1 if you move up, one or more categories, education or occupation. Very simple. We are experimenting with more complex measures of mobility later on, but right now it's a very simple 0-1 binary measure. And what we do is a very straightforward. It borrows from the paper that came out in Economic Development and Cultural Change earlier. What we do is that we have individual level data for each social group in these villages, and we interact that data with dominance variables, which we construct as 0-1 variables. So if you are living in a village dominated by your own social group, like for example, let's take one example here. So if you're OBC living in a village dominated by your own social group, this particular variable here, DOBC, will become 1, 0 otherwise. Same thing for Muslims, same thing for upper caste, same thing for STs, same thing for STs. And at the same time, the other set of variables capturing where you're staying in a village dominated with upper caste, which is why you can see this sort of interactions here. So here an SC individual household, individual living in an upper caste dominated village. In which case this takes the value 1 if that's the case, otherwise 0. So it's just trying to capture what happens to any particular individual in a parental, whether it's the grandparent, parent, or son, whether they're living in either their own dominant villages or in upper caste villages, and to see whether those interaction terms, how are they going to change along these different categories. That's the intuition. So we're interested in essentially the interaction terms, beta 1, beta 1, so on. Sorry, also this interaction term coefficients here and its coefficients here. And that's what we're going to look at. So hopefully this is clear, and I can happily take some Q&A in the question. We can take some clarifications. And we have a set of controls, agroclimatic zones, village segregation, village infrastructure, so on, so which we will get into later. So what we find is that generally when we look at mobility by land dominance, so here let's take again some examples here. If you look at the OBCs, 0 is when they are not living in a village dominated by OBCs. 1 is when they are. And you can see that it doesn't really matter for them, both in downward upward mobility, whether they're living in a village dominated by upper caste or not, or in their own dominated villages. Doesn't matter very much. But for SCs, we seem to see some difference, not much, when it comes to education. Some difference. A little bit more mobility, upward mobility here when it comes to, upward mobility here when it comes to when they live in their own villages. Surprisingly for STs, we see quite a different pattern. Where they are living in a village dominated by their own group, we see much less upward mobility. And that's not only true for education, but also for occupation. So in this case, the story is that the enclave effect, if you wish, is negative. That in other words, you're worse off living in a village dominated by your own group. And of course, there are reasons for that, which I'll get into in a couple of minutes. Muslims, again, same story, at least for education, not so much for occupation. And upper caste, of course, it's pretty obvious that education mobility is higher if you're living in an own dominated village. That's also true in occupation, but not as much. Right. So then when we look at the interaction terms that I showed you in the regression, what do we find? And this is just preliminary work that we find. We find that it's most obvious for SCs that if they live in their own dominated village, they are definitely better off. You can see here the interaction term that in the regression I showed you earlier is positive and significant. Also for occupation. So it seems for SCs, the story is that either both occupation and education, I'm looking at the grandparent-parent pair, we can see greater mobility if you are living in your own dominated village. So that's quite striking. That's not so clear for other social groups, and in fact, in many cases, the standard deviations are quite wide. So we have a negative, the effect is null. But for STs, there seems to be again an evidence of lower mobility in education, not as much as obvious in occupation, if you're living in your own dominated village. What about if you're living in villages dominated by upper caste? Interestingly, for SCs, again, this is a positive effect, which you already observed for their own dominated village. You can see here that the coefficient here for the basic model and the full model, and we have all the controls, is positive and significant. And that's interesting. Not much else happening for other social groups. So we're getting some evidence that there's something specific for SCs, whether they're in their own dominated village or in upper caste dominated village, and some evidence for STs, but this is still work in progress. We're still exploring different specifications. So to summarize, the enclave effect, educational mobility positive for SCs for grandfather, father, and negative for Muslims. We didn't see the other generation pair results here, but negative for Muslim for both grandfather, father, and father, son. Occupational mobility is positive for SCs for grandfather, father. And proximity advantage, positive effect for SCs for education mobility and occupational mobility. So this is something that's quite interesting, that we seem to see different ways the enclave effect and proximity advantage playing out with different social groups for different generation pairs. And that's something that we're exploring more in new work. Now, let me get back to this question about why should we see these effects? What might explain these effects? Well, in this set of regression, what we do is we essentially regress different kinds of mechanisms against the land dominant group. And what we find is perhaps not surprising. When it comes to village infrastructure, using IHG's village level data, whether you have a Pakka road, how far is the Pakka road from the village, whether there's a monsoon road, electricity, pipe, water, bus stop, and so on, and we have a PCA composite measure of all these different indicators, we tend to find that compared to upper caste villages, OBC villages are disadvantaged. In the PCA, you can see it's negative significant. STs are highly disadvantaged. Muslim villages are highly disadvantaged. SC actually, interestingly, not as much. So the story here is that certainly for ST and Muslim villages, and to some extent also OBC villages, we see village public goods being much more inferior when they dominate their own village compared to when upper caste dominate their own villages. So that's quite striking. This very clear difference that we see across in public goods provision across different different villages which are dominated by different social groups. And that's interesting. What about education? Education, again, we have data of the ISGS, whether there is a government school or private school, whether it's a primary school, primary government school, or a mid-level government school, or secondary government school. Again, we construct a PCA for all these three indicators. There again, we find that STs in particular are disadvantaged. Not as much obvious for Muslims, OBCs, and SCs. But the PCA measure that we see right at the extreme column 4, you can see that ST villages are particularly disadvantaged if they are villages which they are dominant. And that, again, is not surprising because we know where these villages are, and they're often in very remote parts of the country. Third mechanism I talked about earlier is locational factors. And again, here it's interesting that if you are if you're in a village that's dominated SCs or STs, and to some extent Muslims also, we seem to see more adverse locational or location disadvantage. So distance to town, distance to district headquarters, separate hamlets, we tend to see more disadvantage. In other words, like separate hamlets is a measure we tend to use to show whether whether the different social groups stay in the same part of the village or not. And there is some data in the IHGS on this. But if you look at distance to town, distance to district headquarters, you can see, especially ST villages are very disadvantaged. You can see the coefficients for these two variables, dependent variables. ST villages are heavily disadvantaged. Surprisingly, not so obvious for the other social groups, and that's again interesting. Finally, on social cohesion, this is a very complicated regression. I just want to sort of just tell a little bit about what we did here. So here we use individual level data, and we try to look at whether you are in a village which is dominated by your own group or an upper caste village, what do we expect to see in terms of village conflict or jati conflict? Again, we did the data on this is there in the IHS individual level questionnaire. And then again, we find, interestingly, that if you are an ST living in your own dominated village, you're going to see much less village conflict and jati conflict. In comparison, if you're a SC living in an upper caste dominated village or OBC living in an upper caste dominated village, you're going to see much greater village conflict and much greater jati conflict. This is suggesting, therefore, that so if you have to summarize, what we can say is that if you are, especially in ST, you have a huge disadvantage in village public goods, huge disadvantage in location. But it seems that if you're living in a village, in an upper caste dominated village, there's far less social cohesion and far more conflict. So while at one level, living in your own dominated village has a disadvantage in terms of location and village public goods, there is an advantage that comes in there when you are living in your own village, because you're going to see less conflict. And that tells you right away the uncliff effect and proximity advantage effect are often moving in in opposite directions, which is why the net effect is often quite difficult to interpret. But it's telling you also that where you stay as a social group in any part of any village in India is dependent on, and your mobility prospects is dependent on the social structure of the village. Whether you are staying in your own dominated village or staying in an upper caste dominated village. And that's quite interesting. Again, we're going to explore more mechanisms, and we're going to try to explore exactly how this play out with looking at further regression. We haven't done that yet. But I think this is telling us that we need to understand village social structure much more closely to understand social mobility in rural India. And I think that's quite interesting. So let me now conclude by just summarizing basically what I said in the lecture, that understanding the patterns of social mobility is essential in knowing whether social justice is being achieved in a particular country. And I think what we're trying to do in UWIDO is trying to push the frontier on social mobility research in developing countries, including India. And we also find, looking at in the Indian case, is that while education mobility has improved for disadvantaged groups over time, this is not the case of occupational mobility. And this particular disjuncture between education and occupation is something that is, I think, should be of great concern to us, scholars working on inequality in India. Third, we also find that whether the parent is a SC, ST, or Muslim matters in a child's education occupational mobility, particularly in the case of occupational mobility, where we're seeing worsening outcomes with mobility, especially if you are SC, ST, or Muslim, compared to, say, OBCs, which as a group hasn't really seen such adverse mobility outcomes. And the final thing that I try to do very quickly in my lecture is talk a little bit about social structure villages. It's, as I said, work in progress, and we need to do much more work here. But I want to make the point here that just as we've seen the interesting work in the case of the US and Rajchetty, there's a lot more work we can do in India using these sorts of data sets and trying to understand social structure issues, less so what is often the interest in the case of the US on education, so on, but I'm trying to understand caste structure in villages. Let me stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, Kunal, for that very wonderful lecture. And I think it's also very timely because there is a conversation going on in India about social mobility at the moment. So I think your research results would provide empirical support to various policy decisions to be taken. Now the floor is open, and what you could do is you could just unmute yourself and ask the question straight to Professor Sen, or you could put your questions in the chat box. I can already see Professor Beena Agarwal has put some questions in the chat box. And so I would now request Professor Beena Agarwal to first make ask her questions, and then followed by Professor Tirthankar Roy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I won't put my video on because my internet is a bit unstable. Hi, Kunal. The really excellent lecture. I'm joining from Cambridge, and good to see you. I had a couple of questions. One is that in this information about mobility, I understand, of course, that IHDS doesn't have, you can't do state level analysis very well. But since this is an ongoing project, we would expect state-wise differences in upward intergenerational mobility, both in education and employment. So for instance, one would expect families to be better off in Himachal Pradesh as versus, let's say, Uttar Pradesh and so on. So I wanted your sense of that. The second was really a bit of a puzzle because, for STs, what you do have is that if you have state level information, or even if you take scheduled areas, if the families are concentrated, ST families are concentrated in scheduled areas, they have political representation. And then there are entire states like Chhattisgarh and so on, which have particular possibilities of political power. And therefore, I was surprised that, STs are really doing so badly on infrastructure and intergenerational mobility. I was wondering whether you might be able to explore looking at this concentration more state-wise, or even scheduled area-wise, because those are the areas where you have PESA reservation and you have had, since independence, the assembly constituency reservations. And so you have ST representatives who you would expect to actually put in more effort to upgrade infrastructure and so on in ST villages in their constituencies. Thanks. I just wanted to mention that some ongoing work, there's a recent paper we did looking at reservation and conservation, and find that, interestingly, conservation is certainly very much better in areas which are reserved for scheduled tribes under PESA or in assembly constituencies as well. Thanks.
Should I answer the Beena's question, Sunil, or do you want me to take two more questions?
No, you could answer her, and then you could take Tirtha's question.
Okay. Right. So, on the state level, I haven't really explored at the state level, partly because I was worried about the number of observations per state. As you know, your IHGS doesn't give you that much in that sense. But I'll look at that. I mean, just even though I would be careful because, as I said, as the more you go down to fewer observations, I'll be more reluctant to talk about mobility. Actually, I didn't show that I had some data on some maps of mobility across India. But then, again, we're worried that whether are we getting enough observations to say something absolutely, with some conviction? And I was a bit surprised when I was seeing more mobility in parts of India, which I didn't expect mobility. That's when I was not sure whether the state level variation is going to be very useful or not. But I'll explore that. Now, on the political power, this is an absolutely fundamental question. And the thing is that that's exactly where we want to take this project next, this particular paper, but there is a challenge, right? Now, what we're doing in this next part of of this paper is we're going to merge the constituency level data on who's won elections in different constituencies, map it to the not village level because we don't know where the villages are. IHS does not reveal the village name or location, but to the districts. And by doing so, we will try to see whether political power for STs, and so on, can also explain to some extent some of the mechanisms we are seeing. But it is interesting, though, that as you noted, that it seems from what we are showing that generally STs are disadvantaged in many different grounds: education, location, and village public goods. Even though, as you noted, that in some states they have had political power. Right now, obviously, we could do it by state, but as I said, I'm a little bit reluctant to do that. But we could do that just to see what we're getting from the state by state analysis. But we are going to look at political office. Now, there is a bit of a, the problem there is that mobility is a long-term phenomenon, right? Especially because you're looking over 3 generations. While political power comes and goes, somebody gets elected today, next election, somebody else gets elected. So we're trying to think through how to capture the fact that we have a slow-moving variable, so to speak, that's mobility over generations. And political power is quite, is where we have politicians changing office from different social groups quite often. Along with that, reservation, as you know, changes too. Certain villages are reserved or constituencies reserved, and then that changes again the next election. So, these are the things which are a bit tricky, but I absolutely agree with you. We need to look at political power, and we need to see whether that makes a difference in explaining mobility patterns also. And exactly the question that if you are ST living in a village or in a district rather, where the power is with your social group, political policy with the social group, does it make a difference? That question we haven't really answered yet, but we are now merging the election data that we have, constituency level data that we have. We have it for quite a long time now. And we're merging that to the IHGS village level, the district level data in IHGS. And hopefully we'll have some answers on that soon.
Yeah, thank you, Kunal. And I'll share our paper where we did it for Chhattisgarh, which over 20 years. So there's another way that you might focus on 1 or 2 states and see how it works out as an illustration.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Tirtho, you could ask your question now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Yes, Tirtho, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, it was a real pleasure listening to this lecture. It's incredibly rich, and I learned a lot about new work in this area. But I was just curious about something that you showed in the very first slide about how you define mobility. And what I thought was missing from there is I mean, a lot of it is about moving up or climbing up, whether income or other benchmarks of social development. But there is another sense, which is moving from less secure jobs to more secure jobs, or moving from seasonal jobs to year-round jobs. Some of these things are very important for economic historians because, I mean, you do have this puzzle over a very long period of time when hundreds of thousands of people are moving, migrating to another kind of jobs, but their wages, real wages, don't go up at all. I mean, it's not just true for India, but it's true for many other societies. And that creates this problem of why do these people move? And then if you probe the data, you see that they are either more secure or maybe secure in terms secure from famine or have year-round jobs. Almost any land-dependent jobs in the past would be extremely seasonal and prone to risk. So I wonder how you factor that in in the definition and whether there is any research going on along those lines.
Right, that's a great question, Tirthankar. I mean, the thing is, and you're absolutely right, that in the way the literature on mobility, and this is not just work that we are doing, but elsewhere also, as you know, there's a big literature on social mobility across both developed and developing countries. The focus has always been on income, occupation, or education, pretty much, or social class also, actually. The sociologists have been very interested in social class movements, right? Like moving from, so the parent is the working class and the son or the child is a professional. That kind of movement is very important in the literature on sociology literature, for example, but not in terms of movement from less secure to more secure jobs. That has not been the case, in part because people, I think of that as within generation mobility. So you move from a less secure livelihoods to more secure livelihoods rather than across generation mobility. But why have we not in the literature looked at that? That's an interesting question. Whether we can with the data sets we have, it's another question. I'm not completely sure whether we can with the current data sets we have to look at the quality of the job, for example, or as you mentioned, how precarious the job is. That's maybe an agenda for the future to broaden how we think of social mobility or intergenerational mobility to include those sorts of dimensions. Hasn't really happened very much, but can be done. But for that, perhaps we might need to have new data sets. The data set that I've been using, which is IHJS, I mean, I should say that in the Indian case, there are perhaps there's no other data set that one can use if you want to use nationally representative data sets. I mean, because the NSS data, which some people have used, I'm very critical of actually. Essentially cannot do this kind of work with cross sections, repeated cross sections. You just cannot. There's a major problem with that. So the papers that have come out using the NSS are heavily flawed. But the problem is then, okay, so I agree with you, but then how do we actually do this in the context of the data sets we have? Is another interesting question. Maybe historians have a different approach. I mean, I should have mentioned that in the book we have, the book volume I talked about earlier, there is a chapter by economic historian Gregory Clark. And Gregory Clark has been working, as you know, in India, but also elsewhere other countries, using surnames and going back to archival data, looking at surnames. So there are historical methods to look at mobility, but not in the way you mentioned. And that's something worth thinking about, definitely. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I think Gayatri had one question. So Gayatri, I think it's more of a clarificatory nature.
So that's fine, but I had one other question. So in the first part of the presentation, could you briefly explain how we measure the inequality of opportunity part?
So that, I think I used a graph that is not my own graph. It's a graph that's produced by this project called the Inequality of Opportunity Project, IOP. So they have got different ways. You know, you can use inequality. You can measure it by the Gini, for example, or standard top 10% inequality. In that they have been using pretty much. I think that's what they've been using, if I'm not mistaken. I should be careful because I haven't really checked what they have used. But in that, but the intuition is very similar, right? The intuition is that is intergenerational mobility correlated with current inequality? In other words, are more unequal societies less likely to see more mobility? And what I said was that the correlation is quite striking. It's very closely correlated, but it's not possible from the diagram I showed to infer causality, right? Because it could be possible that high inequality leads to less mobility. It could also be possible that less mobility, lower mobility leads to high inequality. Causality can run in both directions. In fact, my view is that it does actually run in both directions. So just to kind of, just to clarify that, what we're trying to do in that graph is to make the correlation between current inequality, however measured, Gini is the standard measure, but there are others measures. Net Gini is one measure, but there are many other measures with a measure of mobility, which is across generations. So that's what you're trying to do there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions from the floor? Yes, Mridul. Yes, please.
Dr. Sen, I missed the early part, so I may just be asking something you might have already dealt with. But I wanted to ask you, this data that you're using on mobility, is it gender disaggregated or is it men, completely men?
Very good question. Okay, so here's the problem, okay? And I'll be, this is important for, again, students in this audience to understand. The problem is in the IHGS, as of the most recent round there's a new round going on. So I don't know what the question I will be like on that. The question is that they ask the head of the household, could be a man, could be a woman, right? They ask the head of the household, what is the occupation of your father or education of your father, not also of your mother? In my view, that's a question that should be rectified, right? Because I have now seen some surveys in Sub-Saharan Africa, actually, I'm working on a paper on Cameroon, where they ask the question, head of household, both about the mother and the father, right? And if that was asked, then we could look at mother-daughter mobility, isn't it? Which we can't at this point. So in the IHG, this question is not asked. Now, what you could do, and I'm doing some work on this, but slightly, there's a bit of a risk, and I'll explain the risk in a minute. You could look at in the same household, where the mother's education or occupation, which we'll get from the IHGS, and the daughter's education or occupation, right? But there is one big challenge in India. What's the challenge? When daughters get married, they move from the house, from the family. And we do not know where they move, and the data will not allow us to track that. So if we did mother-daughter mobility using only the same household, I hope you understand what I'm going to say here, only the same household. So we're looking at mother-daughter mobility. We would only be looking at daughters who are unmarried. And that is, again, a selection problem, right? So, there are challenges here, which is exactly, maybe there's a reason why we haven't seen a lot more work on mother-daughter mobility. But this is partly to do with the data we have and not having the right questions in the questionnaire survey, perhaps, but also the nature of mother-daughter mobility is also hindered by the fact that daughters tend to leave the household once they get married, right? So I think it's an important issue that we need to keep in mind, but that doesn't still stop us from doing work on the data we already have. And I would certainly encourage those who are thinking of working on mobility to look at mother-daughter mobility, even with the restrictions that I mentioned, that there are some data restrictions here. I hope that's clear, Vidul. I'm not sure I've answered the question fully.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out how one could do it in some other way. Anyway, I'll think on it. But it's something it should be done, I think. That's
Okay, thank you, Mridul. The next question is from Shraddha Jain. Shraddha, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question yourself?
Thank you, sir. Sir, to follow up from Professor Eben's question, so partly you have answered partly of my question, but my another question is, can we look at father's education or mother's education and difference in educational attainment of sons and daughters? Will that also reflect on social mobility restricted to the children who are residing with the parents? So I understand the issue with girls moving out after marriage, but at least we can look at the educational attainment part. Secondly, in the earlier section of your presentation, you mentioned about role of mothers for changing norms, and that could lead to social mobility. Can you please explain that? And my last question is about role of migration in social mobility. So IHDS data also, I think, allows you to explore that. These are my three questions.
Can I just add something here? Something just struck me. Supposing in the household, the head of the household is a woman. There are now 30%, for instance, in Kerala households, there are female-headed households. Supposing that question was asked to, as Shraddha says, to the residing daughter, could that not be done? The head of the household is a mother, and where does the girl reach? Levels of education, levels of occupation. That's something which could be done, isn't it? I'm just
Absolutely.
adding. I'm just adding to her question.
So,
Please
like
answer
when,
hers.
yeah, sorry. Also, to clarify, when we talk about intergenerational mobility, can't we look at father-daughter thing, or like, is it? I understand looking at mother-daughter, but from father to daughter, is that not a way of looking at it?
All right, very good question. This is a really, really great. I mean, these are really important questions, actually, not just about the Indian case, but understanding mobility, like the conceptual literature on mobility, right? Because there was a reason why people focus on father-son, because obviously there are issues that come up when you look at father-daughter or mother-son. But there's no reason why that has to be the case, right? I mean, you're right to say that you could have looked at father-daughter or mother-son. There is nothing that stops you from looking at them. I would certainly say that one should go ahead and do it. And exactly as Midul said, that you could look at where the head of the household is a female, and as Midul was saying, in Kerala, there are quite a few of such households with where the head of the house is female. You could look at the resident daughter's education or occupation. Maybe it's a bit tricky, but education certainly, right? So before they get married. Now, it partly applies more to states where women get married later. If you have early marriage, and therefore early marriage obviously means movement out of the household often, that's a bit of a problem, right? So maybe in northern India it's a bit of a problem, but in Kerala it's possible, or other parts of southern India. So I would certainly say, that this is an area where one could do more work, looking at mother-daughter, but also father-daughter, and so on, different ways of doing it, looking at resident daughters, right? Now, actually, again, the IHTS does also report non-resident daughters, their occupation education. That's there too, right? But they're not very good. And it is understandable tracking daughters who left the family, the household. In other words, married to some other household. That's where the problem is of married daughters who leave the household, and that is very difficult to then track. And I hope again, in the future we could do more of that. We do need to see what happens to daughters who get married, leave some, to join some other household, and see what happens to them with education, occupation. So these are all very exciting questions for future research, isn't it? And I think this is where I think there's so much work to be done in the Indian context. Now about norms, I think there is a very important way that it might happen, right? If the mother is working in, say, in a high level occupation, not perhaps an agricultural laborer, it does have a strong positive spillover effect on the daughter, right? These are aspirational issues I mentioned. These are important. And this changes in social norms have been important in explaining why in some parts of the developing world, we do seem to see mother-daughter mobility, right? So that's a really important thing, because mothers, when they go to work, they can be role models. They can also provide information about future career prospects and so on and so forth. You can imagine many ways where mothers going to work can provide information for their daughters, right? Especially work that is obviously at the higher occupational level. So this is why I strongly urge that those who are thinking of future research in mobility in India, there's a lot to be done. And the other thing I should mention, that so far I've talked about quantitative data. But clearly you can do qualitative methods without the same problems you're facing in quantitative data. You can use life histories, you can use anthropological methods, and in fact, Divya Vaid makes a very strong argument for using anthropological or ethnographic methods to understand mobility. Because quantitative data is simply not going to be ever good enough for a long time. For example, on income. We may have to wait for a long time to get reliable income data in India. So for that reason, I think it's very important to use other methods, especially qualitative methods, to understand mobility. And again, I think there has been some nice work happening using non-quantitative or qualitative methods, where you don't have the same restrictions that you face when you use existing data sets. And on migration, I think that's, again, we can look at that. I mean, the question of whether that, so if you think about it, in a household, there are two children. Let's just say, for sake of argument, both are daughters, and one of them moves to the city to work, the other doesn't. Is it likely that the one who's moved to the city to work is going to see higher occupational mobility than the one who hasn't? That's not so obvious, right? It could be possibly more likely that they would have had moved to higher occupations, possibly, but it's not so obvious. I mean, we often see in India that people move from villages to cities, actually moving down, perhaps. So becoming a construction worker in the city. So again, that's an interesting question, that is it the case that migration leads to more mobility? Is there a causal relationship there? Answer is we don't know actually. It could be the case, but we haven't yet seen enough evidence on that. And I think that's really, again, very another exciting research direction. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. Do you have time to answer these two?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the questions are really nice. So I'm enjoying answering the questions.
Okay. Okay. Now, Madhusudan Nag, a PhD student here, he wants to ask you the social mobility in the context of this recent debate on allowing reservations for economically weaker sections. Because he says that if you have an affirmative action and give advantages to one group, it will be at the cost of the other.
Yeah, I mean, this, I didn't want to get too much into this debate on affirmative action because it's a bit, it's a tricky issue. One thing should say that I was struck, and in fact, when I first looked at these patterns in the earlier paper in EPW, but more recently, I was struck by the fact that we seem to see this downward mobility so evident among those who are from ST/SC backgrounds, right? And it tells you right away that affirmative action is not going to be the solution in itself, because imagine that the parent, the father, got let's say government job through affirmative action, but it's not obvious the child will benefit from that, and it is very, I would say, extremely worrying that we're seeing downward mobility in households where we have parents reaching a certain level of occupation or education, where the child does not seem to achieve that. And the mobility downwards often is quite drastic. Often we seem to see movements right to the bottom of the occupation ladder. So what I'm going to say here is that affirmative action is one part of what we need to do to change what's happening in India. It cannot be the only solution. And I think that's where I think we need to understand that those who come from upper caste backgrounds often have a history, a legacy of, they're in those kind of households. The children know where to apply, what to try and to do in terms of career prospects. They have a lot of knowledge there that's tacit, implicit, which disadvantaged social groups will not have in those households. And that's why I think there's the fact that we're seeing less occupational mobility among SC/ST groups over time tells us that we need to think much more systematically about why is that happening, and not just think of affirmative action as the only solution, which unfortunately in India, that seems to be the way it's been addressed so far. It's also linked to better jobs and so on and so forth, and all of the things that I mentioned as policy options. So this to be, I think what our research is showing is that there's a systematic problem right now for certain social groups in India, which we need to address in a much, much more holistic way than we have so far. Thanks.
Right, thank you. Now, the last question is from Sri Manjari Guha, again a PhD student here. She wants to ask whether you can elaborate on the relationship between social mobility and networks. And for caste association, will it have a different impact for men and women? And as we know, caste associations might restrict women.
That's again a very good question. So social networks are not necessarily always positive. That's the point I think that the question is making. The person is making. They're absolutely right. It's not obvious that social networks are always positive in terms of mobility outcomes. No, that's right. Because sometimes they are, many times they are, but sometimes they are not. Caste associations are examples that they may not be positive. But networks do matter. I mean, if you think about it, how do people get jobs? It's not obvious in the way the typical economist thinks about it. You apply for a job, you go to the formal labor market and so on. That's not the way it happens in India, especially in rural India. And again, there's been work, in fact, done by one of my co-authors of this paper that I mentioned at the end, Vegard Iversen, that shows that job referrals matter. So you move to the city, you get a job working in a restaurant, and then your employer asks you, can you find out somebody else to come and work here? And you say, oh yeah, I know somebody in the village, and they refer that person to your employer. That's the way a lot of jobs happen, especially in the informal sector. So that's where networks matter. And this could be caste-based networks, but not always caste-based networks. So I think the general point here, which the question is trying to unpack, is networks, when are they welfare improving in terms of more mobility, and when are they not welfare improving? And I think that's a really important thing to study more, especially in the context of occupation. And the other thing I should mention that in recent years in economics, there's been a lot of understanding of aspirational failures. That is to say that even if a child is given good education and so on, but the child, imagine a child in a village in India, where the child is not able to get knowledge about what kind of jobs to apply for outside the village, perhaps. That's when it's very important thing about how networks can help and how role models can help. I mean, often you hear stories, and Anirudh Krishna has been working on this for quite a long time, where the village, often in the village, a teacher, somebody who becomes a teacher from a Dalit background, makes a big difference to other children from the same background in the village. So role model effects are very powerful. And that's something that one should think more about. That how can we create more positive role models, especially in rural India, where we can imagine that those who come from certain kind of disadvantaged backgrounds, if they see positive role models, that will indefinitely make them want to try to aspire to those kind of jobs. And I think this is something that I think we need to understand a little bit better. Now, obviously, creating more positive role models is not something from a policy point of view that's straightforward. Having said that, there are a lot of NGOs working on this in this area of social mobility who are trying to do that, trying to create examples of positive role models especially among poor children, and try to see whether that makes a difference or not. And I think that's again a very exciting area of both of research, but also of advocacy and practice.
Okay, thank you, Kunal, for answering everything so elaborately and comprehensively. And I think we have come to the end of the lecture. And everyone would agree with me that this was actually a fitting tribute to the memory of late Professor B.G. Kumar. We are extremely grateful to Professor Kunal Sen for sparing his valuable time and giving such a nice lecture, and also the reference to his most recent works, especially the book which deals with concepts, methods, and determinants of social mobility. And I think it should be quite useful to students. Thank you so much for sparing your valuable time and giving this very wonderful lecture. And I thank everyone for participating in this afternoon's lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mani. I should say that any students in the audience want to reach out to me about some of the things I talked about, feel free to do so. We're very happy to respond.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye.